The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Windsor Castle, casting long shadows across the ornate carpet of the private sitting room. Kate sat curled in the velvet armchair that had become her refuge over the past weeks, her fingers wrapped tightly around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. The delicate china trembled slightly in her hands, a testament to the emotional storm that raged within her. Across the room, Camilla stood by the window, her silhouette framed against the gardens beyond. She had been there for nearly an hour, saying nothing, simply watching. Her presence was both comforting and unsettling, a reminder that Kate was not alone in her pain, yet also a constant witness to her vulnerability. The sound of heavy footsteps in the corridor made both women turn toward the door. Charles entered with the measured pace of a man carrying the weight of centuries on his shoulders, but his usually composed expression betrayed the turmoil beneath. His jaw was set in a hard line, and his eyes held a fire that Kate had rarely seen before. The meeting with the palace advisors went as expected, Charles said, his voice carefully controlled but edged with frustration. He moved to pour himself a whiskey despite the early hour, his movements sharp and precise. They want to manage this situation with their usual diplomatic nonsense. Kate felt fresh tears spring to her eyes. This situation he referred to as her life, her marriage, her children's future, reduced to a problem that needed managing. She had known this day would come, had felt it building like a storm on the horizon, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of it. What did they say exactly? Camilla asked softly, finally moving away from the window. Her voice carried the experience of someone who had weathered similar storms, who understood the machinery of the palace in ways that Kate was still learning. Charles set down his glass with more force than necessary, the crystal ringing against the wooden surface. They want her to make a public statement, something about personal difficulties and taking time for reflection. His voice dripped with disdain, as if 20 years of marriage can be summarized in a carefully worded press release. The tears Kate had been fighting finally spilled over. 20 years. 2 decades of her life devoted to this institution, to this family, to a man who had gradually become a stranger. She thought of William and Harry, now grown men with families of their own, and how they would react to the news that their parents' marriage was finally, officially over. "I can't do it," Kate whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can't stand in front of those cameras and pretend that this is mutual, that it's amicable. Not when I know the truth." Camilla moved closer, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. She had changed since becoming queen consort. There was a gravitas about her now, a sense of authority that had been earned through years of public scrutiny and private sacrifice. Yet in this moment, she looked at Kate with genuine compassion. "The truth has many faces in this family," Camilla said gently, settling into the chair beside Kate. "I learned that lesson the hard way, many years ago. Sometimes the truth that serves the institution is the only one that matters." Kate looked up at her through tear-blurred eyes. "How did you bear it? All those years of being painted as the villain, having your every move scrutinized, your every word twisted." A shadow passed over Camilla's face, and for a moment, Kate saw beneath the polished exterior to the woman who had endured decades of public hatred and private pain. "I had something to fight for," Camilla replied simply. "Love makes us capable of enduring almost anything." Charles had been pacing the length of the room, but at these words he stopped abruptly, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, and Kate could see the muscles in his jaw working as he struggled with emotions he couldn't voice. "Love," he repeated, the word coming out like a curse. "They want to strip that down too, reduce it to talking points and image management. They want Kate to say she wishes me well, that she supports my reign, that this is all very civilized. And what's wrong with that?" Kate asked, though she already knew the answer. The question came out sharper than she intended, fueled by months of frustration and hurt. Charles turned to face her, and in his eyes, she saw a pain that matched her own. "Because it's not true, is it? None of it is true. You don't wish me well, you don't support what I've become, and this is anything but civilized. The honesty of his words hit Kate like a physical blow. She doubled over slightly, the sobs finally coming in full force. All the anger, all the disappointment, all the years of trying to make something work that had been broken from the start, it all poured out of her in a torrent of grief. Camilla reached out instinctively, placing a comforting hand on Kate's shoulder. But Kate shrank away from the touch, not out of malice, but from a need to feel her pain fully, to not be comforted just yet. You're right, Kate managed between sobs. I don't wish you well. I wish you were the man I married. I wish you were the father our children needed. I wish you had chosen us over duty just once. Charles stood frozen, watching his wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, fall apart in front of him. The sight of her tears seemed to ignite something primal in him, a protective instinct warring with his anger at the situation they found themselves in. Do you think this is what I wanted? He asked, his voice rising despite his efforts to remain calm. Do you think I chose any of this? I've been preparing my entire life to be king, and now that I am, I'm watching everything I care about crumble around me. You chose the crown over your family at every turn. Kate shot back, lifting her head to meet his gaze. Her eyes were red and swollen, but they blazed with a fury that had been building for years. Every state dinner was more important than Harry's school play. Every constitutional crisis took precedence over William's struggles. Every duty came before us. The words hung in the air between them, like accusations written in fire. Camilla shifted uncomfortably in her chair, caught between her loyalty to Charles and her growing sympathy for Kate. She had been the other woman once, the one who took a husband away from his wife. But this was different. This was watching a marriage die not from infidelity, but from the slow poison of neglect and competing priorities. Charles's face had gone white with anger, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely controlled. I gave you everything I could. I gave you titles, status, protection. I made you a princess, and now I've made you a queen. I never wanted to be a queen. Kate exploded, rising from her chair so quickly that her cold tea spilled across the expensive rug. I wanted to be your wife. I wanted our children to have a father who was present, who put them first sometimes. I wanted a marriage, not a royal obligation. The silence that followed was deafening. Charles looked as if he had been slapped, the truth of her words cutting deeper than any carefully crafted insult could have. He had spent so long thinking in terms of duty and service that he had forgotten how to think in terms of simple human love. Camilla watched the exchange with growing alarm. She had seen Charles angry before, at the press, at politicians, at the constraints of his role. But this was different. This was personal, raw, and potentially destructive. She could see him struggling with the desire to defend himself against Kate's accusations, while simultaneously recognizing the truth in them. I did what I thought was right, Charles said finally, his voice hollow. I tried to serve the country, to honor my mother's legacy, to be the king she prepared me to be. And, in doing so, you forgot how to be human, Kate replied, her anger giving way to a deep sadness that seemed to age her before their eyes. You forgot how to be a husband, a father, a man who could love something more than his duty. Charles turned away from her, unable to bear the accusation in her eyes. He walked back to the window where Camilla had been standing earlier, looking out at the gardens where he had played as a child, where he had walked with his mother, where he had first brought Kate to meet the family all those years ago. Perhaps you're right, he said quietly. Perhaps I did forget, but it's too late to change that now. The resignation in his voice was almost worse than his anger had been. Kate felt her heart break a little more, mourning not just the end of their marriage, but the death of the hope that things could ever have been different. Camilla stood slowly, sensing that her presence was no longer helpful. I'll leave you two to talk, she said diplomatically. But, Kate, dear, remember that the children will be watching how you handle this. They'll take their cues from you about how to process their own feelings about the situation. Kate nodded, though she wasn't sure how she was supposed to model grace and dignity when she felt so utterly broken. As Camilla moved toward the door, she paused beside Charles and placed a gentle hand on his arm. "You can still choose love," she said softly, so quietly that Kate almost didn't hear. "It's not too late for that." But Charles didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge her words. He remained at the window, his shoulders rigid with tension, lost in thoughts that seemed to offer no comfort. When the door closed behind Camilla, leaving Charles and Kate alone, the silence felt different, heavier, more final. They were no longer performing for an audience, no longer moderating their words for the sake of appearances. They were just two people who had once loved each other, now facing the wreckage of that love. Kate wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and tried to compose herself. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Do I read the statement they've prepared? Do I smile and wave and pretend that my heart isn't breaking?" Charles turned back to her, and she was surprised to see that his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've never had to end a marriage in public before. I've never had to explain to the world why love wasn't enough." The admission hung between them, an acknowledgement of the impossible position they found themselves in. Kate felt a fresh wave of tears threatening, but she forced them back. She had cried enough for one morning. "Maybe we should have tried harder," she said, though even as she spoke, she knew it wasn't entirely true. They had both tried, in their own ways, for years. "Maybe we should have been different people," Charles replied. "Maybe I should have been someone who could put love before duty. Maybe you should have been someone who could accept that duty comes first." Kate shook her head. "We are who we are, Charles. We can't change that now." He nodded, accepting the truth of her words, even though it offered no comfort. They stood there in the morning light, two people who had shared 2 decades of their lives, who had raised children together, who had once promised to love each other until death did them part. Now, they were planning the death of their marriage, dissecting it with the clinical precision of surgeons. The sound of footsteps in the corridor announced the arrival of the palace staff, come to brief them on the day's schedule, to discuss the timing of announcements and the coordination of statements. The real world was intruding on their private grief, demanding that they transform their personal tragedy into a public relations exercise. Kate straightened her shoulders and smoothed down her skirt, already beginning the process of putting on her public face. Charles adjusted his tie and cleared his throat, preparing to step back into his role as the dignified monarch. But for just a moment longer, they looked at each other as simply Charles and Kate, two people whose love story was ending not with a bang, but with the quiet whimper of duty overcoming desire, of institution outlasting intimacy. The future stretched out before them, uncertain and lonely, but there was no turning back now. The machine of the monarchy was already in motion, transforming their private pain into public theater, their personal failure into a constitutional necessity. As the staff entered the room, Kate and Charles moved apart, both physically and emotionally, beginning the long process of becoming strangers to each other. But the image that would stay with Kate long after the divorce was finalized was the sight of Charles standing by that window, tears finally falling down his cheeks, mourning not just their marriage, but the man he might have been if he had chosen differently. The first day of the rest of their separate lives had begun, and already Kate could feel herself changing, hardening, preparing for a battle she never wanted to fight, but knew she could not avoid. 3 weeks had passed since that morning confrontation, and the palace had become a battlefield of whispered conversations and carefully managed leaks. Kate found herself living in a strange limbo, still technically the queen, but already being treated as if she were a ghost haunting the halls of her former life. The children had been told, of course. That conversation had been the hardest thing Kate had ever had to do. William had taken the news with the stoic dignity he had inherited from his father, but Kate had seen the flash of pain in his eyes before he carefully masked it. Harry had been more emotional, more openly angry, demanding to know why they couldn't just work things out like normal people. "Because we're not normal people," Kate had told him, hating the words even as she spoke them. "We belong to the country now, and the country has opinions about how we should conduct our lives. Now, as Kate sat in what had once been her private study, she could hear the sounds of the palace staff beginning to remove her personal belongings. Each muffled thump of a box being loaded, each whispered instruction about which items belonged to her, and which would remain with the crown, felt like another small death. Camilla appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 cups of tea and wearing an expression of careful neutrality. She had been walking a tightrope these past weeks, trying to support both Charles and Kate while protecting her own position in the increasingly volatile situation. "I thought you might need this," Camilla said, offering Kate one of the cups. The gesture was simple, but in the context of their complex relationship, it felt like an olive branch. Kate accepted the tea gratefully, though her hands still shook slightly when she held delicate things. She had developed a tremor over the past few weeks, a physical manifestation of a stress that was eating away at her from the inside. "How is he today?" Kate asked, though she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to know the answer. Camilla settled into the chair across from Kate's desk, the same chair where she had sat through countless meetings over the years, offering advice and support to her stepdaughter-in-law. "Angry," she said simply. "Angrier than I've ever seen him." Kate nodded. She had expected as much. Charles's anger had been building steadily since the palace advisors had begun discussing the public narrative surrounding their divorce. The story they wanted to tell was one of mutual respect and amicable separation, but the reality was far messier and more painful than anything that could be sanitized for public consumption. "The press has been brutal," Kate said, gesturing toward a stack of newspapers that her staff had tried to hide from her. Despite their efforts, she had seen the headlines, read the speculation about her mental state, her fitness as a mother, her supposed inability to handle the pressures of royal life. "They always are," Camilla replied with the weariness of someone who had endured decades of media scrutiny. "I remember when Charles and I were going through our difficulties. Every day brought fresh accusations, new theories about what was really happening behind closed doors." Kate looked up at her sharply. "But you and Charles worked through it. You found your way back to each other." A shadow passed over Camilla's face. "We did eventually, but not before we both nearly destroyed ourselves in the process. And we had something you and Charles don't have. We had started from a place of genuine love, real understanding. We were fighting to get back to something that had been real." The implication hung in the air between them. Kate and Charles had been arranged, in a sense, their marriage more of a merger than a love story. They had grown to love each other, or thought they had, but perhaps what they had really learned was to love the idea of each other, the roles they played rather than the people they truly were. "Do you think we ever really knew each other?" Kate asked, voicing the question that had been haunting her for weeks. Camilla considered this carefully. "I think you knew parts of each other. The public parts, the official parts. But Charles has spent so many years being the Prince of Wales, and now the king, that sometimes I think he's forgotten who he is underneath all of that." The sound of raised voices from the corridor interrupted their conversation. Kate recognized Charles's voice, though she couldn't make out the words. He was arguing with someone, his tone sharp and commanding in a way that made both women tense. The door to Kate's study burst open without ceremony, and Charles stormed in, his face flushed with anger. Behind him, 2 of his private secretaries followed, looking harried and concerned. "Sir, if we could just discuss this further," one of them began, but Charles cut him off with a sharp gesture. "I've heard enough," Charles snapped. "Leave us." The secretaries exchanged worried glances, but obeyed, closing the door behind them with obvious reluctance. Charles stood in the middle of the room, breathing heavily, his usual composure completely shattered. "What's happened?" Camilla asked, rising from her chair with alarm. Charles's eyes found Kate's, and she was shocked by the raw fury she saw there. "They want to blame you," he said, his voice thick with disgust. "The communications team, the advisors, the whole bloody lot of them. They want to paint you as unstable, unable to cope with royal life." Kate felt the blood drain from her face. "What exactly are they saying?" "That you've been struggling with mental health issues for years." That the pressure of being queen has been too much for you. That I've been trying to support you through your difficulties, but ultimately, for the good of the monarchy, we've had to make the difficult decision to separate. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Kate's sharp intake of breath. She had known this was coming, had sensed it in the careful questions from staff, the way certain advisors had started looking at her with calculating eyes. "And you agreed to this?" Kate asked, her voice deadly quiet. "Of course I didn't agree to it." Charles exploded, his carefully maintained royal composure finally cracking completely. "Do you think I would let them destroy you like that? Do you think I would let them make you into some kind of tragic figure who couldn't handle being married to the king?" Kate felt tears spring to her eyes again, but this time they weren't just tears of sadness. There was relief there too, a gratitude that Charles was still capable of protecting her, even if he couldn't love her the way she needed. "But they're going to do it anyway," she said. It wasn't a question. Charles's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Not if I have anything to say about it. I may not have been the husband you deserve, Kate, but I'll be damned if I let them crucify you for the failure of our marriage." Camilla had been watching this exchange with growing concern. She could see the dangerous territory they were entering. The way Charles's protective anger could easily transform into something that would damage not just the monarchy, but all of them personally. "Charles," she said carefully, "we need to think about this strategically. The palace advisors aren't doing this out of malice. They're trying to protect the institution." "The institution," Charles repeated, the words dripping with contempt. "Always the bloody institution. When did I become a slave to an institution instead a man capable of making his own decisions?" Kate stood up abruptly, unable to remain seated any longer. The combination of fear, anger, and exhaustion was making her feel physically ill. "Maybe they're right," she said quietly. "Maybe I'm unstable. Maybe I am unfit to be queen." "Don't you dare," Charles said, whirling to face her. "Don't you dare let them make you believe that." "Why not?" Kate shot back, her voice rising. "Look at me, Charles. Look at what I've become. I can't hold a teacup without shaking. I cry at the smallest provocation. I haven't slept through the night in weeks. Maybe they're not wrong." Charles crossed the room in 3 quick strides, reaching out as if to take her by the shoulders, then stopping himself at the last moment. They stared at each other for a long moment, the space between them charged with 20 years of shared history and accumulated hurt. "You're not unstable," Charles said firmly. "You're heartbroken. There's a difference, and I should know because I'm the one who broke your heart." The admission hung in the air between them like a confession. Camilla felt as if she were intruding on something intensely private, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. This felt like a crucial moment, one that could determine not just how the divorce proceeded, but how all 3 of them would emerge from this crisis. "You didn't break my heart on purpose," Kate said softly. You chose other things. Over and over again, you chose other things." "I chose what I thought was right," Charles replied, but there was less conviction in his voice now. "I chose what I was taught to choose." "And what about what I taught you?" Kate asked. "What about the times I tried to show you that love could be a priority too? What about the times I begged you to choose us, just once?" Charles turned away from her, unable to meet her eyes. "I thought I was protecting you by maintaining my dignity, by being the king you could be proud of." "I was never proud of you being king," Kate said, the words coming out in a rush. "I was proud of you when you read bedtime stories to the children. I was proud of you when you comforted me during my father's illness. I was proud of you when you were just Charles, not when you were wearing the crown." The truth of her words hit Charles like a physical blow. He had spent so many years trying to be worthy of the crown, try to live up to the legacy of his mother, that he had forgotten that the people who loved him loved the man, not the monarch. "It's too late now," he said quietly. "I can't undo 20 years of putting duty first." "No," Kate agreed, "you can't. But you can choose how this ends. You can choose whether to let them destroy me to protect your image, or you can find another way." Camilla finally spoke up, her voice gentle but firm. "There's another way," she said. "But it would require both of you to be completely honest with the public and that's something the palace will fight against with everything they have. Charles and Kate both turned to look at her, and Camilla took a deep breath before continuing. You could tell the truth. Not the sanitized version, not the carefully crafted narrative, but the real truth. They are two people who cared for each other, but wanted different things from life. That the pressures of the monarchy made it impossible for you to build the kind of marriage you both needed. They'll never allow that, Charles said immediately. The advisors, the government, they'll say, undermines the authority of the crown. Then, maybe it's time to stop asking for permission, Kate said, a note of steel entering her voice for the first time in weeks. Maybe it's time to remember that we're human beings first and royal figures second. Charles stared at her in amazement. This was a side of Kate he hadn't seen since the early days of their relationship, when she had been willing to challenge him, to push back against the constraints of royal protocol. You're talking about war with the establishment, he said. You're talking about taking on the entire system that has supported the monarchy for centuries. I'm talking about taking control of our own story, Kate replied. I'm talking about refusing to be sacrificed on the altar of public relations. The three of them stood in silence for a moment, each contemplating the magnitude of what Kate was suggesting. It would be unprecedented for senior members of the royal family to openly challenge the palace's communication strategy. It would be seen as a betrayal of everything they had sworn to uphold. But as Charles looked at Kate, really looked at her for the first time in months, he saw something that made his decision clear. He saw the woman he had married, the one who had been strong enough to love him despite his flaws, brave enough to challenge him when he was wrong. She was still there, underneath all the pain and disappointment. What exactly are you proposing? He asked quietly. Kate took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice was steady for the first time in weeks. I'm proposing that we tell the world exactly what happened to our marriage. Not because we want to hurt each other, but because we want to protect our children from growing up thinking that love isn't worth fighting for. And if the palace tries to stop us... Kate smiled for the first time in days, though it was a sad smile. Then we remind them that we may be their employees, but we're still human beings with our own voices. Charles felt something shift inside him, some long-dormant part of his personality awakening. For the first time in years, he was being asked to choose between duty and humanity, and this time the choice felt clear. The advisors won't like it, he said. No, Kate agreed, they won't. The press will have a field day. Probably. It could damage the monarchy. Kate looked at him with eyes that were finally clear of tears. Charles, she said gently, what do you think this is already doing to the monarchy? What do you think it does to the crown when its bearer sacrifices everyone who loves him to protect an image? Charles felt the last of his resistance crumble. Kate was right, of course. She had always been right about the things that truly mattered. He had just been too proud, too frightened, too invested in being the perfect king to listen to her. All right, he said quietly. We'll do this your way. But we do it together, and we do it as honestly as we can bear. Kate nodded, and for a moment, they looked like the team they had once been, united in purpose if not in love. Camilla watched this exchange with a mixture of admiration and concern. She could see the potential for both triumph and disaster in what they were planning. But she could also see that it was the only path that offered them any hope of emerging from this crisis with their dignity intact. I'll support you however I can, she said quietly. But you need to understand that once you start down this path, there's no going back. The palace will never forgive you for choosing honesty over diplomacy. Charles and Kate looked at each other, and in that moment they made a silent pact. They would face the consequences together, not as husband and wife, but as two people who had shared too much history to abandon each other to the wolves. The war for control of their story was about to begin, and for the first time in weeks, both of them felt ready to fight. The emergency meeting was called for 6 o'clock in the morning, an hour chosen deliberately to emphasize the crisis nature of the situation. Kate arrived at the palace conference room to find it already filled with grim-faced advisors, communication specialists, and senior palace officials. The tension in the room was palpable, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Charles was seated at the head of the long mahogany table, his posture rigidly formal, but his eyes blazing with suppressed anger. He had barely slept since their conversation 3 days ago, spending his nights pacing his private chambers and rehearsing the words he planned to say to the assembled officials. Sir Marcus Wendell, the palace's most senior communications advisor, stood at the far end of the room beside a projection screen displaying poll numbers and public opinion data. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of strain. His tie was slightly askew, and there were dark circles under his eyes. "Your Majesties," Sir Marcus began, his voice carefully controlled, "I'm afraid the situation has become even more complicated since our last meeting. We've received word that several major newspapers are preparing exposé pieces about the state of your marriage. They have sources claiming intimate knowledge of private conversations." Kate felt her stomach drop. She had expected resistance from the palace, but she hadn't anticipated that their private pain would become tabloid entertainment regardless of what they decided to do. "What kind of intimate knowledge?" Charles asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Sir Marcus cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Details about arguments, accusations of emotional neglect, claims about your Majesty's priorities regarding state duties versus family obligations." He paused, glancing nervously at Kate. "There are also suggestions about Her Majesty's mental state and her ability to cope with royal responsibilities." The room fell silent except for the sound of Kate's sharp intake of breath. She had known this was coming, but hearing it stated so bluntly in front of a room full of strangers felt like a violation that went beyond anything she had experienced before. "I see," Charles said, and Kate could hear the barely controlled fury in his voice. "And what exactly do you propose we do about these sources who seem to know so much about our private lives?" Sir Marcus exchanged glances with his colleagues before responding. "Sir, we believe the best course of action is to get ahead of the story with our own carefully crafted narrative. We can control the messaging if we act quickly." "The same narrative you proposed before?" Kate asked, finding her voice despite the tremor she could hear in it. "The one where I'm portrayed as mentally unstable and unable to handle royal life." "Your Majesty," another advisor interjected, "we understand this is difficult, but public perception of the monarchy's stability is paramount. If we can frame this as a health issue rather than a marriage failure—" "Stop." Charles's voice cut through the room like a blade. The single word carried such authority that everyone fell silent instantly. "You will not frame my wife's perfectly rational response to an impossible situation as a mental health crisis." Kate looked at Charles in surprise. Despite everything that had happened between them, despite the pain and the anger and the irreconcilable differences, he was still protecting her. The realization brought tears to her eyes, but this time they weren't tears of sadness. "Sir," Sir Marcus said carefully, "with all due respect, we need to consider what serves the institution best." Charles stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. "The institution," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room, "serves the people, not the other way around. And I will not serve an institution that requires me to sacrifice my family's dignity for the sake of public relations." The statement sent a shock wave through the room. Palace officials exchanged alarmed glances, clearly recognizing the implications of what the king was saying. "Your Majesty," Sir Marcus said, his composure beginning to crack, "you cannot seriously be considering going against established protocol in a matter of this magnitude." "I can," Charles replied simply, "and I am." Kate felt a surge of something she hadn't experienced in months, pride in her husband. This was the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago, the one who could be brave when it mattered, who could choose to do the right thing even when it came at personal cost. "Charles," she said softly, "are you sure about this?" He turned to look at her, and she saw in his eyes a resolve she hadn't seen since the early days of his reign. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," he said. "We're going to tell our story, Kate. Our way in our own words, and damn the consequences." The room erupted in barely controlled chaos. Advisors began speaking over each other. Phones were pulled out to make urgent calls, and Sir Marcus looked as though he might faint. Through it all, Charles and Kate remained seated, an island of calm in the storm of bureaucratic panic they had unleashed. Camilla, who had been silent throughout the meeting, finally spoke up. "If I may," she said, her voice cutting through the noise with the authority of years of experience. The room gradually quieted as everyone turned to look at her. "I've been through something similar to this," Camilla continued, "though perhaps not quite as public. I know what it's like to have your personal life dissected by people who don't know you, to have your story told by others who have their own agendas." She paused, looking around the room at the assembled officials. "And I can tell you that the only way to survive it with your dignity intact is to tell the truth yourself before others tell their version of it." Sir Marcus turned to her with obvious desperation. "Your Majesty, surely you understand the delicate nature of royal communications. The public expects a certain level of discretion from the royal family." "The public expects honesty," Camilla replied firmly. "They've had enough of carefully crafted statements that say nothing while hiding everything. If Charles and Kate are brave enough to be honest about their marriage, the public will respect them for it." Kate felt a warm surge of gratitude toward Camilla. For someone who had once been seen as the enemy of the royal family, she had become an unexpected ally in this fight for authenticity. "What exactly are you proposing?" asked David Henley, the deputy private secretary, his voice tight with anxiety. Charles looked at Kate, seeking her permission to speak for both of them. She nodded, and he turned back to address the room. "We're proposing a joint interview," Charles said, "conducted by someone we trust, someone who will let us speak honestly about what happened to our marriage without sensationalizing it or turning it into a circus." "Absolutely not," Sir Marcus said immediately. "The risks are far too great. One wrong word, one emotional moment, and the damage to the monarchy could be irreversible." "The damage is already done," Kate said quietly, but her words carried clearly through the room. "The damage was done the moment we started pretending that our marriage was something it wasn't, the moment we chose to protect an image instead of our family." Charles nodded. "Kate's right. We've been so focused on maintaining appearances that we've forgotten the people we're supposed to be serving. The British public aren't fools. They can see when something isn't right. They deserve to hear the truth from us." "And what truth would that be exactly?" Sir Marcus asked, his voice edged with sarcasm. "That 20 years of marriage meant nothing? That the monarchy is so demanding it destroys the personal lives of those who serve it?" "The truth," Charles said steadily, "is that sometimes two good people want different things from life, and sometimes love isn't enough to bridge that gap. The truth is that we try to make it work, but we both made mistakes, and ultimately we couldn't find a way to be happy together without sacrificing parts of ourselves that were too important to lose." The simple honesty of his words seemed to deflate some of the tension in the room. Kate felt tears threatening again, but this time they were tears of recognition. This was the conversation they should have had years ago, the acknowledgement of what had gone wrong without blame or bitterness. "The children," said Margaret Thornfield, the Queen's private secretary. "Have you considered how this will affect William and Harry? They're adults now, but they're still your sons." Kate and Charles exchanged a look. This had been one of their biggest concerns, the thing that had kept them awake at night planning this course of action. "We've talked to them," Kate said. "They know what we're planning to do, and they support it. They said they'd rather have parents who are honest about their struggles than parents who lie to protect an institution." "Harry said something particularly wise," Charles added with a slight smile. "He said that watching us pretend to be happy was worse than knowing we were sad, because at least sadness is real." The room fell quiet as the advisors absorbed this information. The fact that the royal children supported their parents' decision to speak openly would make it much harder for the palace establishment to oppose them. Camilla leaned forward slightly. "There's something else to consider," she said thoughtfully. "This approach could actually strengthen the monarchy in the long run. The public has been moving away from institutions they see as outdated and disconnected from real life, showing that royal marriages face the same challenges as everyone else's, and that royal people are capable of handling those challenges with grace and honesty that could actually increase public respect for the family. Sir Marcus looked as though he had bitten into something bitter, or it could open the floodgates for every member of the royal family to air their personal grievances in public. Where does it end? Do we next have interviews about financial disputes, family arguments, personal health issues? It ends, Charles said firmly, with treating each situation on its own merits and remembering that the people who serve this institution are human beings first and public figures second. Kate watched the faces of the advisors around the table and could see them calculating, weighing the risks and benefits, trying to find a way to minimize damage while accepting that their preferred course of action had been firmly rejected. If you're determined to proceed with this, Sir Marcus said finally, his voice resigned, then we need to discuss parameters. Ground rules, topics that are off limits, preparations. No, Kate interrupted, surprising everyone, including herself, with the firmness of her voice. No ground rules, no prepared statements, no topics off limits. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it honestly or not at all. Charles looked at her with something approaching admiration. This was the Kate he remembered from their early days together, the one who had been brave enough to challenge him when she thought he was wrong, confident enough to stand up for her principles even when it was difficult. Kate's right, he said. The moment we start managing the conversation, we're back to the same old game of hiding the truth behind carefully crafted lies. Then, at least let us help you choose the interviewer, Margaret Thornfield pleaded. Someone who understands the delicate nature of the situation. We've already chosen, Kate said. We want to do it with Elizabeth Murray. A collective gasp went around the room. Elizabeth Murray was known for her tough, no-nonsense interview style. She was respected for her fairness, but she was also famous for asking the questions that other journalists wouldn't dare to ask. She'll destroy you, Sir Marcus said bluntly. She'll ask about everything, the loneliness, the arguments, the impact on the children, the future of the monarchy. She won't hold back just because you're royal. Good, Charles said simply. That's exactly why we want her. The public will trust what we say to her, because they know she won't let us get away with half-truths or evasions. Kate felt a mixture of terror and excitement at the prospect. Elizabeth Murray wouldn't be gentle with them, wouldn't let them hide behind platitudes or royal protocol. But that was exactly what they needed, someone who would force them to be completely honest, even about the parts of their story that were painful to acknowledge. When? Asked David Henley, clearly accepting that this was going to happen whether the palace approved or not. As soon as possible, Charles replied. Before the newspapers publish their stories, before we lose control of the narrative completely. Sir Marcus pulled out his phone, already beginning to make the calls that would set this unprecedented event in motion. His face was grim, but Kate could see that he was also beginning to calculate how to make the best of a situation he couldn't control. As the meeting began to break up around them, Charles and Kate remained seated, both lost in their own thoughts about what they had just committed to doing. They were about to bare their souls to the entire world, to admit publicly that their fairy tale marriage had been anything but fairy tale. But for the first time in months, Kate felt a sense of hope. They were finally going to tell the truth, and whatever happened next, at least it would be honest. At least they would face the consequences of their own words, rather than the carefully constructed lies of palace spin doctors. The war for their story was about to begin in earnest, and they were finally ready to fight it together. The interview was scheduled for the following evening to be broadcast live from one of the palace's smaller, more intimate drawing rooms. The decision to do it live had been Kate's. She wanted no opportunity for editing, no chance for the palace communications team to soften their words or remove the moments of raw emotion that would make their honesty credible. As the day dawned gray and drizzly, Kate found herself surprisingly calm. She had spent the night walking through the palace gardens, thinking about all the things she wanted to say, all the truths she had kept buried for so long. The prospect of finally speaking them aloud felt both terrifying and liberating. Charles had been less serene. Camilla had found him in his study at 4 in the morning, surrounded by papers and constitutional documents, trying to convince himself that what they were about to do wouldn't bring down the monarchy he had spent his entire life preparing to lead. Second thoughts? Camilla had asked gently, settling into the chair across from his desk. Constant second thoughts, Charles had admitted, but not enough to stop us. Kate deserves this chance to tell her side of the story, and so do I. Now, as the afternoon wore on and the television crew set up their equipment in the drawing room, the palace felt like a powder keg waiting to explode. Staff members whispered in corners, their faces tight with anxiety. Several senior advisors had made last-minute attempts to convince Charles and Kate to reconsider, but both had remained firm in their decision. Elizabeth Murray arrived at 4 o'clock, 3 hours before the scheduled broadcast. She was a small, sharp-featured woman in her early 50s, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing and a reputation for preparation that was legendary in journalism. Kate watched her examine the room where they would conduct the interview, noting how she tested the lighting, the camera angles, the acoustics. She's making sure there's nowhere to hide, Kate murmured to Camilla, who had remained close by throughout the day, offering quiet support without judgment. That's what you wanted, isn't it? Camilla replied. No hiding, no pretending, just truth. Kate nodded, though she felt her stomach flutter with nervousness. It was one thing to decide to tell the truth in the abstract. It was quite another to sit across from one of Britain's most respected journalists and expose the most painful parts of your life for public consumption. Elizabeth Murray spent an hour with Charles and Kate separately, not to rehearse questions or coordinate answers, but to understand the emotional landscape she would be navigating. She spoke with each of them about their boundaries, not topics they wouldn't discuss, but ways they preferred to discuss difficult subjects. I want you both to know, she told them when they gathered together in the drawing room for final preparations, that I will ask you difficult questions. I will push you when your answers feel incomplete. My job is not to protect you from discomfort, but to help you tell your story as completely and honestly as possible. Charles straightened his tie nervously. We understand. That's why we chose you. Good, Elizabeth replied briskly. Then let's begin. The opening moments of the interview were formal, almost stilted. Elizabeth asked about their early relationship, their wedding, the transition into royal life. Charles and Kate answered politely, their responses careful and measured. But as the questions became more personal, more probing, the careful facades began to crack. When did you first realize that your marriage was in serious trouble? Elizabeth asked, her voice gentle but direct. Kate and Charles looked at each other, and in that moment of silence, 20 years of accumulated pain seemed to pass between them. I think, Kate said slowly, it was when I stopped expecting him to choose us over his duties. When I realized I had accepted that we would always come second to the crown. And when was that? Elizabeth pressed. Kate's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away from the camera. Harry's graduation from university. Charles missed it because of a state dinner that could easily have been rescheduled. That night, I looked at our son's disappointed face and realized that I had been making excuses for 20 years for a man who would always choose duty over family. Charles shifted uncomfortably beside her. That's not entirely fair, Kate. You knew when you married me what my responsibilities would be. I knew about your responsibilities to the country, Kate replied, her voice gaining strength. I didn't know that would mean you had no responsibilities to us. Elizabeth leaned forward slightly. Charles, how do you respond to that? Charles was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with regret. I thought I was protecting my family by being the best king I could be. I thought if I served the country well, if I honored the crown, that would somehow benefit them too. I was wrong. What do you mean by wrong? Elizabeth asked. I forgot that being a good king means nothing if you're a failure as a husband and father. I let an institution convince me that duty was more important than love, and by the time I realized my mistake, it was too late. The admission hung in the air between them. Kate wiped tears from her cheeks, but she looked at Charles with something approaching forgiveness. "It wasn't just Charles," she said quietly. "I made mistakes too. I should have fought harder for what we needed as a family. I should have demanded more instead of just accepting that this was how royal marriages worked." "What kind of demands would you have made?" Elizabeth asked. Kate took a shaky breath. "I would have insisted that our children's important moments came before state functions. I would have demanded real vacations, time when we could just be a family without the cameras and the protocol. I would have asked Charles to talk to me like a partner instead of like another member of his staff. And if he had said no to those demands, then at least I would have known where I stood," Kate replied. "At least I wouldn't have spent 20 years hoping things would change." Charles looked stricken. "Kate, I never knew. You never asked," she interrupted gently. "You assumed I was happy because I didn't complain, but I didn't complain because I knew it wouldn't change anything." Elizabeth Murray watched this exchange with the focused attention of a skilled interviewer, letting the emotion play out naturally before asking her next question. "Charles, there are reports that you've been struggling with anger throughout this process. Can you tell us about that?" Charles's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Kate thought he might refuse to answer. But then his shoulders sagged slightly, and he nodded. "I've been furious," he said simply. "Furious at the advisors who wanted to blame Kate for our marriage failing. Furious at a system that demands we sacrifice our humanity for the sake of public relations. Furious at myself for taking so long to realize what I was doing to the people I love most. Has that anger affected your ability to rule effectively?" Charles considered this carefully. "It's made me question everything. Every decision, every protocol, every tradition that puts the institution ahead of the people it's supposed to serve. Maybe that's not a bad thing." "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe the monarchy needs to evolve. Maybe we need to remember that we serve the people, not the other way around. Maybe being honest about our struggles makes us more relatable, more human, more worthy of public support." Elizabeth turned back to Kate. "How has this process affected your view of the royal family?" Kate was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully. "It's shown me that even institutions that have lasted for centuries can change, can grow, can become more compassionate. Camilla has been incredible throughout this. She could have taken the safe route and stayed out of it, but instead she supported both Charles and me in finding a way to end our marriage with dignity. Tell us about Camilla's role in all of this." Kate smiled through her tears. "She's been the voice of wisdom when Charles and I were too hurt to think clearly. She's reminded us that we can choose to end our marriage without destroying each other or our children. She's shown us that it's possible to tell the truth without being cruel." Elizabeth looked between Charles and Kate. "So where does this leave you now? What does the future look like?" Charles and Kate exchanged a look, and for a moment, they looked like the partners they had once been, united in purpose if not in love. "We'll always be connected," Charles said, "through our children, through our shared history, through our commitment to serving the country. But we'll do it separately, as friends rather than as husband and wife." "And you believe that's what's best for the monarchy?" "I believe," Kate said firmly, "that it's what's best for us as human beings. And if the monarchy can't support its members in being honest about their struggles, then maybe the monarchy needs to change." Elizabeth Murray asked several more questions about the practical aspects of their separation, about their children, about their future roles. But the emotional heart of the interview was complete. They had done what they set out to do. They had told their story honestly, without blame or bitterness, acknowledging their failures while maintaining their dignity. As the interview concluded and the cameras stopped rolling, Kate felt emotionally drained but oddly peaceful. They had burned their bridges with the palace establishment, had probably guaranteed themselves years of criticism and second-guessing. But they had also taken control of their own narrative, had refused to let others define their story for them. Charles sat beside her in the sudden quiet of the room, both of them processing what they had just done. After a moment, he reached over and took her hand, not as a husband, but as a partner in the most honest conversation either of them had ever had in public. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For making me remember who I used to be. Who I could still be if I have the courage." Kate squeezed his hand gently. "We both have to find the courage now. This is just the beginning." Camilla approached them slowly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'm proud of both of you," she said simply. That took extraordinary courage. Over the next few hours, as news of the interview spread and the palace communications team went into crisis mode, Kate felt a strange sense of liberation. Whatever came next, the criticism, the speculation, the constitutional debates, at least it would be based on truth rather than carefully constructed lies. The marriage of Charles and Kate was ending, but in its final act, it had become something it had rarely been during its lifetime: completely honest. They had chosen love over duty in the end. Not romantic love, but the deeper love of respect, of honesty, of allowing each other to be fully human despite the constraints of their extraordinary lives. As Kate packed her belongings the next morning, preparing to leave the palace for the last time as queen, she found herself crying again. But these tears were different from all the others she had shed over the past months. These were tears of grief, yes, but also of relief, of gratitude, of hope for a future where she could finally be herself without apology. Camilla appeared in the doorway, watching Kate fold her clothes with the careful attention to detail that had characterized her entire royal career. "Any regrets?" Camilla asked gently. Kate considered the question seriously. "I regret that it took us so long to be honest with each other. I regret the years we spent pretending everything was fine. But I don't regret choosing truth in the end, even if it cost us everything else." "It didn't cost you everything," Camilla said softly. "It gave you something too. It gave you back yourselves." Kate nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. For the first time in 20 years, she was free to be Kate rather than the queen, to make choices based on what she needed rather than what was expected of her. The future was uncertain, but it was hers to shape, and that, she realized, was worth all the pain it had taken to get here. As she took one last look around the rooms that had been her home for 2 decades, Kate felt a profound sense of completion. The story was ending, but it was ending on their terms, with honesty and dignity intact. Charles appeared in the doorway, come to say goodbye. They stood looking at each other for a long moment. These two people who had shared so much history, so much pain, and, finally, so much truth. "Take care of yourself," Charles said simply. "You too," Kate replied. "And remember what we learned, duty matters, but so does humanity. Don't forget that again." He nodded, and she could see in his eyes that he understood. The crown would remain on his head, but the man beneath it had been fundamentally changed by this experience. As Kate walked out of the palace for the last time as a member of the royal family, she carried with her not just her possessions, but a hard-won wisdom about the price of honesty and the value of truth. The fairy tale was over, but the real story, the story of two people learning to be human in impossible circumstances, was just beginning.